What if, all of a sudden, you discovered that everything you believed about your life's work had slipped into silence? On a rainy night, billionaire Alexander Whitmore stepped into one of his own restaurants disguised as an ordinary man. He expected nothing more than a simple meal, but what he witnessed inside, the silent tears of a waitress no one seemed to notice, would shake his heart deeply. That night would become the moment when the truth about his empire, and about himself, could no longer be ignored. The rain fell in thin silver threads over Manhattan, blurring the neon lights of the Upper East Side into a soft glow, almost like an impressionist painting. The city never truly slept, but on that cold night, even the sidewalks seemed quieter, the usual noise muffled by the persistence of the weather. A yellow taxi stopped at the corner of 72nd Street, and from the back seat stepped out a man few would recognize. Alexander Whitmore raised the collar of his coat against the wind, the rough wool brushing against his skin. There was no private driver that night, no sleek black car waiting at the door, no entourage surrounding him. At 58, with silver already streaking his temples and deep lines etched into his face, Alexander looked like just another tired New Yorker seeking shelter from the storm. And that was exactly how he wanted to appear. Because on that night, he wasn't arriving as the billionaire who had built an empire of luxury hotels and restaurants. He wasn't the man on magazine covers, or the one whose business decisions moved markets. That night, he was just Alex. And Alex had questions that could never be answered in a boardroom. The Whitmore Grill stood just ahead, its bronze sign gleaming under the rain, its glass doors glowing with the warmth of light and the promise of laughter. 40 years earlier, his journey had begun there. Back then, the space was nothing more than a modest bistro with 12 tables, a dream, and more determination than money. He himself waited tables, washed dishes when the kitchen fell behind, and memorized the name of every customer. That restaurant had been his lifeblood. It was there he learned that hospitality was never about plates or profit margins, but about people. And for years, he had promised himself he would never lose sight of that truth. But promises made in youth can be buried under the weight of success. Now, with 24 establishments spread across 3 states, Alexander feared he had become the very kind of man he once despised, distant, obsessed with quarterly reports, blind to the humanity behind the numbers. In recent months, a few complaints had begun to surface. Not many, his managers insisted customer satisfaction remained high. But Alexander trusted instinct over reports. Something was wrong. And the only way to discover the truth was to see it with his own eyes. He stepped inside, and the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him like an embrace. Yet something felt off. The chandeliers glowed as always, the mahogany bar shone, the tables were covered in white linens, and the hum of conversation filled the room. But beneath the sparkle lay an emptiness, as if everyone were performing in a play they no longer believed in. Alexander paused near the entrance, letting his gaze sweep across the dining room. He saw waiters moving quickly between tables, their smiles mechanical. He heard the laughter of a group of businessmen in the center, but the sound felt brittle, almost hollow. The energy that had once made the place pulse was now tense, like a guitar string pulled too tight. "Just one," the hostess asked, without lifting her eyes from her phone. Her voice was monotone, her attention split between the glowing screen and the guest standing before her. "Yes," Alexander replied. She grabbed a menu with the enthusiasm of someone carrying grocery bags. Without another word, she led him to a table near the kitchen doors, the kind of seat usually reserved for customers from whom little in tips was expected. She dropped the menu on the table and vanished, already typing another message. Alexander settled into the chair, his eyes sweeping the room once again. He had once sat at every one of those tables in the days when every customer felt like family, and every night ended in exhaustion mixed with satisfaction. Now, he felt like a stranger in his own home. From his spot near the kitchen, he could study the choreography of the staff in detail. The young waiters rushed from table to table, balancing trays with practiced efficiency, but impatience marked their faces. Greetings were cold, service stripped down to the bare minimum. The little gestures that turned a meal into a memory, the refilled glass before it emptied, the genuine smile, the feeling of being seen were nowhere to be found. Alexander's chest tightened. This was not the restaurant he had built. And then, just as he was about to lower his eyes to the menu, he saw her. Near the service station stood a woman in her early 40s, her hair pulled back into a simple bun, already loosening from the long shift. Her name tag read Julia Anderson. She wasn't the youngest or the fastest on the team, but there was something about the way she moved that drew attention. Julia moved differently. While the younger waiters rushed, Julia lingered for a few moments at each table, asking about the customer's day, refilling glasses before they were empty, leaning closer to catch the faint voice of an elderly woman. Her smile wasn't the forced mask of her colleagues, but a genuine smile that reached her eyes, though, when she thought no one was watching, Alexander noticed the weariness hidden behind it. The dining room demanded much from her that night. At one table, a couple argued loudly over their order, taking out their frustration over a kitchen mistake on Julia. At another, a man in an expensive suit tapped his glass impatiently, snapping his fingers for the delayed wine. A group of college students laughed boisterously, one of them throwing out a cruel remark about middle-aged waitresses who should have retired by now. Julia absorbed it all with quiet dignity. She apologized with sincerity, soothed tempers with patience, and still found ways to make each guest feel cared for. Alexander saw her bring crayons to an anxious child, noticed her leaning in to offer a word of encouragement to a nervous young man on his first date, and caught her slipping an extra candle onto the dessert of a couple celebrating their wedding anniversary. She was the beating heart in a room that had forgotten how to feel. But behind the grace were cracks. The droop of her shoulders when she turned away, the faint tremor in her hands as she balanced plates, the discreet pauses to take a deep breath as if reminding herself to keep going. Alexander ordered a simple roast chicken from a passing waiter, but his attention never left Julia. He couldn't shake the sense that she carried more than trays and orders. Something deeper, heavier, was hidden behind her persistent smile. Then, after tending to a particularly difficult table, where a customer scolded her for bringing the wrong side dish, Julia slipped into a narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. And for a brief moment, her facade collapsed. Alexander saw her raise a trembling hand to her face, wiping away tears she thought were invisible. The scene struck him like a stone thrown into still water. His throat tightened. Here, in the restaurant he had built with dreams of warmth and belonging, stood a woman breaking in silence, unnoticed by everyone except him. And in that instant, Alexander knew this night would not be just another secret visit. Something was deeply wrong. And the answers he sought were standing right before his eyes. Outside, the storm pressed harder against the glass windows of the Whitmore Grill, but inside, the rhythm of dinner service drowned out any sound of the rain. Dishes clattered in the kitchen, silverware chimed against porcelain, and voices rose in the familiar hum of a busy night. Yet to Alexander, it all felt strangely hollow, like listening to an orchestra where half the instruments had gone silent. And then, there was Julia Anderson. At first glance, she blended in with the other servers, the same pressed uniform, the same polished but worn black shoes, the same posture, tired, yet professional. But there was something different about her, something in the way she lingered just a moment longer at each table, something in the patient softness of her voice, something in her eyes when she smiled. Julia wasn't the fastest waitress. She didn't rush like the others, desperate to turn tables and move on. Instead, she moved with intention, as if every customer mattered. And to her, they did. Alexander leaned back in his chair, pretending to study the menu, but in truth, he was studying Julia. He watched her serve water to a table of executives in suits that probably cost more than her monthly rent. They barely acknowledged her, tossing out their orders distractedly before returning to their phones and market forecasts. Still, Julia smiled, repeating each order carefully to ensure no mistakes, even as one of them sighed loudly at the delay. At another table, a couple in their 30s argued in low but harsh tones, letting their frustration spill over when the wrong appetizer arrived. Alexander watched Julia absorb their cutting words without flinching, apologizing sincerely, offering to replace the dish and most impressively managing to calm them to the point that, when she returned, they were already speaking to each other more gently. And then there was the elderly man sitting alone in the corner. He wore a tweed jacket too big for his frame and glasses that slipped down his nose every few minutes. Other waiters barely paid him attention, but Julia stopped by twice to refill his teacup before he even asked. Alexander noticed how she leaned in slightly, drawing closer to catch his frail voice amid the noise. She laughed softly at something he said, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder in a gesture of genuine kindness. It was in those moments that the contrast between Julia and her colleagues became most striking. Where others rushed, she lingered. Where they wore forced smiles, she offered true warmth. But kindness comes at a cost. Alexander saw it in her body language, the hunch of her shoulders, the tightness in her jaw, the faint tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching. And though her smile rarely faltered, there was a shadow behind it. A group of young professionals at table 7 deepened that shadow. They were loud, laughing boisterously at their own jokes, raising glasses of expensive wine and toasts to recent achievements. One of them, hair slicked back and a cocky grin on his face, leaned in his chair and said loud enough for Julia to hear, "Isn't it funny? Middle-aged waitresses still running around like this. What's the point? Shouldn't they already be retired?" The others laughed. Julia's cheeks flushed, but she didn't reply. She simply set the plates down carefully, her movements steady despite the humiliation. Alexander's hand clenched tightly around his fork, the urge to rise almost overtaking him. But he stayed silent, watching. Because that was why he had come. Not to intervene in a single moment, but to understand the truth of what happened in his restaurant when no one thought they were being watched. Minutes later, Julia approached another table, where a young man in a dress shirt fidgeted nervously with his napkin, his eyes darting away from the girl across from him. It was clearly a first date, awkward silences, broken conversation, restless hands. Julia noticed it too. As she served their drinks, she leaned in discreetly and murmured, "You're doing fine. She's smiling at you." The young man's eyes widened in surprise, and he let out a nervous laugh. Julia winked at him before walking away, and Alexander saw the tension at the table ease, the boy's confidence subtly growing. It wasn't in the training manual. It wasn't part of the job description. But Julia made people feel seen. Alexander asked another waiter for a glass of water, deliberately not from her, so he could continue watching without drawing attention. His heart tightened as he gathered the small details, the stitched seam on her sleeve, the worn but polished shoes, the automatic gesture of tucking stray strands of hair behind her ear when she was distressed. She was holding herself together, but barely. Back at the service station, Julia picked up a tray, steadying it with hands that trembled more than before. A bowl of soup nearly slipped as she adjusted it, and Alexander noticed the quick glance over her shoulder, making sure no one had seen her falter. No one, except him. A sharp voice cut through the noise. "Julia! Table 12 is still waiting. Hurry up!" It was the manager. Alexander recognized him from previous reports, standing with arms crossed near the bar, impatience dripping from his tone. Julia nodded quickly, apologizing softly, though the mistake wasn't hers. She balanced the tray and hurried off, the smile back on her face as if nothing had happened. Alexander's chest burned with indignation. This was not how it was supposed to be. His restaurants had been founded to be sanctuaries, places of respect, warmth, and care. And there was Julia, embodying everything good about hospitality, treated as if she were invisible. The minutes dragged on. Plates came and went. Julia managed 6 tables at once, never missing a detail, never forgetting a preference. Alexander saw her remember that a woman at table 4 was celebrating a wedding anniversary and bring out a dessert with a candle, even though it hadn't been requested. He saw her crouch down to pick up a dropped toy and return it with a playful smile that made the little boy burst out laughing. It was almost an art, the way she worked. But an art that came at a steep price. Near the end of the shift, Julia stepped into the narrow hallway between the kitchen and the dining room. This time, Alexander had a clear view. He saw her shoulders trembling as she covered her eyes with her hands, her whole body shaking from exhaustion and the weight of emotions too heavy to bear. For a few seconds, she allowed herself to break. Just a few. Then she drew a deep breath, smoothed her uniform, lifted her chin, and returned to the dining room as if nothing had happened. Alexander's heart clenched. He had come searching for answers about declining quality, numbers, and efficiency. But what he found was something far more human, far more painful. Julia Anderson was breaking in silence. And no one seemed to notice. Except him. He leaned back in his chair, his mind in turmoil. He had built this empire. He had once promised himself that his restaurants would always put people first. Had he drifted so far from that vision that someone like Julia could dedicate 8 years of her life here and still feel invisible, forgotten, worthless? The question gnawed at him as he watched her return to the floor, her smile once again painted on her tired face. And then, as if fate had chosen to strip away any illusion, Alexander noticed the whispers from the young waiters when Julia walked past, the rolled eyes, the spiteful laughter. He saw her offer to help carry dishes, only to be dismissed with a cold wave of the hand. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the smile falter for just a moment before she composed herself again. Invisible. That's how they treated her. Alexander's throat tightened. This wasn't just inefficiency. It was something deeper, something poisonous that had taken root in his restaurant. And as Julia passed by his table again, eyes weary but smile steady, Alexander felt the weight of a revelation crash down on him. This woman could be the key to understanding everything. But at what cost, if no one else chose to see her? The night dragged on at the Whitmore Grill, and the storm outside seemed to mirror the tension mounting inside the restaurant. The glass vibrated under the pounding rain, while distant thunder reminded that the world outside was in chaos, but nothing compared to the storm Alexander felt within. He had seen enough to understand that the decline in service quality had nothing to do with the menu, nor with the customers. The root was right there, before his eyes, hidden among silver trays and forced smiles. And at the center of it all was Julia Anderson, the invisible waitress. Alexander leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her, though his thoughts were already elsewhere. It was time to confirm something. Just how deeply had this culture of arrogance and disdain infiltrated his restaurant? He discreetly called over another waiter, a young man in his 20s, tie crooked, movements rushed. A bottle of Chateau Margaux, 2005 vintage, Alexander requested, his voice neutral. The waiter blinked, confused. "Sir, that bottle it's very expensive," he murmured, unable to hide his surprise. Alexander raised an eyebrow. "So what? Can you get it?" The young man nodded quickly and hurried off to the bar. Alexander knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just about wine, it was about observing how the staff reacted when something out of the ordinary happened. Minutes later, it was Julia who brought the bottle. The manager, arms crossed, watched from a distance, visibly displeased. Alexander noticed it. The man seemed resentful every time Julia stood out. She set the bottle on the table with steady hands, though her voice was soft. "Sir, would you like me to open it, or would you prefer the sommelier to come over?" Alexander smiled faintly. "I'd like you to open it." The silence that followed was subtle, yet palpable. The manager cleared his throat loudly, as if his disapproval could intimidate her. But Julia held her ground. With steady movements, she cut the foil, twisted the corkscrew, and poured the glass without spilling a single drop. Alexander raised the glass, examining the wine under the golden light of the chandelier, but what he was truly assessing was something else, her confidence, despite the invisible weight pressing on her shoulders. As he tasted the wine, his eyes roamed the dining room. The manager moved from table to table with a stern expression, scolding waiters for the smallest details, yet never raising his voice with influential customers. His authoritarianism was selective, harsh toward the weak, lenient toward the powerful. In that instant, Alexander realized the true problem in the restaurant. It wasn't a lack of training, it was toxic leadership. He needed to see just how far it would go. Moments later, an impatient customer complained about the delay in receiving his dish. The manager swooped in like a hawk and, in front of everyone, pointed at Julia. "This is your fault. You should have delivered this order 10 minutes ago." Julia froze for a second. She knew, and so did Alexander, that the mistake had come from the kitchen. But she didn't argue. She only lowered her head, murmured an apology, and rushed off to fix it. Alexander clenched his fists beneath the table. The humiliation was public, cruel, calculated. The kind of gesture that slowly erodes someone's confidence. When Julia returned with the dish, the customer was already irritated, ready to complain again. But she set the plate before him with an authentic smile and said, "I apologize for the delay. I made sure to ask the chef to prepare it again so it would be perfect." The man, surprised by her attitude, softened his expression and merely nodded. The tension dissolved. Alexander watched in silence, feeling his chest tighten. Julia wasn't just working, she was salvaging experiences. Turning frustration into care, coldness into warmth. But how long can someone carry such a burden alone? The clock neared 10 o'clock when the inevitable happened. Julia, exhausted, carried a tray with 4 steaming plates. The dining room was crowded, and a customer suddenly stood up, nearly colliding with her. Reflexively, Julia swerved, but one of the plates slipped, crashing to the floor. The entire restaurant went silent. The sound of shattering porcelain rang out like a gunshot. The manager wasted no time. Incompetent, he shouted, striding toward her. "What do you think you're doing? That dish costs more than your week's wages." Julia flushed, crouching immediately to gather the shards, her hands trembling. Alexander leaned forward, his heart racing. He almost stood, almost revealed everything right there. But he held back. The moment wasn't right yet. And then it happened. Julia cut her finger on one of the fragments. Blood stained the napkin she used to clean it. The manager crossed his arms, indifferent. "Go to the kitchen, take care of it, and get back quickly. We don't have time for sentimental nonsense." The cruelty of the phrase echoed across the dining room. Some customers muttered in indignation. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Alexander, however, did not look away. He recorded every detail. 15 minutes later, Julia returned, a makeshift bandage on her finger, resuming work as if nothing had happened. But Alexander saw through it, her eyes more weary, her shoulders heavier. Even so, she still found strength to smile at a child, to wish a couple happy anniversary, to place a fallen rose back into its vase. It was as if, despite everything, she still believed kindness mattered. And in that contrast, Alexander found his answer. It wasn't Julia who was failing. It was the restaurant. It was the leadership. It was him, for not having seen it sooner. The manager, however, continued his marathon of arrogance. Every minor mistake became a spectacle of humiliation. Every gesture of Julia's went unnoticed. Alexander knew the climax was approaching. He discreetly asked for the check. The amount didn't matter. The true price of that night would be paid in another way. Julia brought the bill, placing it carefully on the table. The smile was there, but her eyes betrayed the exhaustion. "I hope you had a good experience, sir." Alexander stared at her in silence for a few seconds. Those weary eyes spoke louder than any report. "I did," he replied at last, enigmatically. When she walked away, Alexander drew a deep breath. The moment to reveal who he was close. But he wanted everyone present, customers, waiters, the manager. He wanted it to be undeniable. The storm outside showed signs of fading, but inside the restaurant the tension only grew. Alexander rose slowly, adjusting his jacket, and walked to the center of the dining room. Curious eyes turned toward him, while Julia kept working, not yet realizing what was about to happen. The manager, irritated, approached. "Sir, please, sit down. You're disrupting the restaurant's flow." Alexander stopped, his gaze steady, his voice calm but heavy with an authority no one yet recognized. "Disrupting? Perhaps. But I believe the real problem here isn't me." The dining room fell silent. Julia froze mid-step, tray in hand, startled. Alexander took a deep breath. The next words would change everything. "My name is Alexander Whitmore. I am the owner of this restaurant." Shock rippled through the room like electricity. And as the manager paled before him, Alexander knew the moment of reckoning was near. What would Alexander do now that he had revealed his identity? Who would be held accountable, and how would Julia react upon discovering who he really was? The Whitmore Grill's dining room seemed suspended in time. Glasses half-raised, conversations frozen midair, astonished eyes fixed on the man standing at the center. "My name is Alexander Whitmore," he repeated, his voice firm, sounding like thunder rivaling the storm outside. "And I am the owner of this restaurant." A murmur spread among the guests. Shock was etched on every face. Some straightened in their chairs, others lowered their eyes discreetly, as if only in that instant realizing who sat before them. The manager, however, seemed drained of all color. The man who moments earlier barked orders with arrogance now shrank back, breath caught in his chest. Julia, standing in the aisle with the tray in her hands, stared at Alexander without blinking. The world seemed to spin around her, but her eyes saw only the man who, just minutes earlier, had seemed like any other customer. Alexander swept the room with his gaze. Every detail was etched into his mind: the cruel laughter of the young men at table 7, the indifference of the executives, the weariness hidden in Julia's smile. "I came here tonight to see with my own eyes," he said, pausing between words. "Reports can lie. Numbers can mislead. But the human eye never fails." He let the silence linger. The manager tried to regain composure, stepping forward on unsteady feet. "Mr. Whitmore, if I had known you were coming," he stammered. Alexander raised his hand, cutting him off like a blade. "Exactly. You didn't know," he replied, his voice cold. "And it's precisely when no one is watching that a man's true character appears." The entire dining room remained mute. Alexander turned slowly to face the manager. "This woman," he pointed to Julia, who swallowed hard under so many eyes, "spent the entire night serving with more dignity than anyone else here. She was humiliated, ignored, overworked, and yet, she brought humanity to every table she touched." The manager opened his mouth, but Alexander did not allow it. "I saw you yell at her. I saw you blame her for mistakes that weren't hers. I saw you treat her as if she were disposable, when she was the only one truly keeping this place standing." The words fell like hammer blows. Julia felt her heart race. A mixture of shame and relief coursed through her body. At last, someone saw what was happening. The manager tried one last defense. She's not efficient. She's slow. Customers complain." Alexander stepped forward, his gaze blazing. "Efficiency without humanity is the quickest path to ruin," he declared, his voice sharp. "You talk about speed, but you fail to see that she is the one who brings customers back. You don't see that a genuine smile is worth more than 1,000 plates served in haste." The manager's eyes widened, realizing the inevitable. "Mr. Whitmore, You're fired." Alexander cut him off, each syllable heavy, final. The impact of the words made a few customers gasp softly. The waiters froze where they stood. The manager paled, his mouth opening in silent despair. For a moment, he seemed ready to protest, but the authority in Alexander's gaze was crushing. With no choice, he turned, walked across the dining room with his head bowed, and disappeared through the kitchen doors. The crack of thunder outside seemed to mark his last step. Alexander drew a deep breath, turning back to the customers and staff. I regret that you had to witness this, but it was necessary, he said solemnly. This restaurant was founded to be more than a place of luxury. It was meant to be a space of respect, of human warmth. And if we let arrogance corrode our values, then we lose everything. He looked once more at Julia. This waitress, Julia Anderson, has shown me more than any report or audit ever could. She showed me what it means to serve with heart. Julia blushed, trying to retreat, but Alexander beckoned her with a firm gesture. Come here. She hesitated, her hands trembling, but slowly stepped forward until she stood before him. The entire dining room followed her every move. Julia, Alexander said, softening his voice. How many years have you been here? 8, sir, she answered, barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded. 8 years. 8 years of invisible dedication, enduring more than you should have, carrying a weight that was never yours. She tried to protest, but he raised his hand. No. You don't need to justify yourself. I saw everything tonight. And I say this before everyone, you are the heart of this restaurant. Alexander raised the wineglass still on his table. To everyone here, raise your glass with me, he commanded. Not to me. Not to the Whitmore name. But to Julia Anderson, who kept this place alive even when others tried to suffocate it. Customers and waiters, still stunned, lifted their glasses. A toast echoed through the dining room. Tears welled in Julia's eyes. Never, in 8 years, had she been recognized like this. Alexander leaned slightly toward her. Julia, from this day on, you will no longer be invisible. A murmur rippled through the restaurant. Alexander let the silence return before continuing. I am restructuring this restaurant, he announced. And I want you to be an essential part of that change. Julia's eyes widened. Me? But, sir, I'm just a... You are not just anything, Alexander interrupted firmly. You are living proof that kindness and dedication still matter. And from now on, I want you to be the team leader. A collective gasp spread across the dining room. Some waiters exchanged incredulous looks. Julia brought a hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her racing heart. I don't know what to say. Alexander smiled. Just say yes. The rest, we'll figure out together. The atmosphere had completely changed. Customers who once ignored Julia now watched her with respect. Some even applauded discreetly. The waiters, embarrassed, lowered their eyes. Alexander, however, did not spare them. And to the rest of the team, learn from her. If you cannot treat people with respect, you have no place in my house. The words were sharp, but necessary. Julia, still in shock, bowed slightly in a gesture of gratitude. Thank you, sir. Truly. Alexander responded with a look both firm and warm. Don't thank me. Just keep being who you already are. But not everyone was pleased. At the back of the dining room, the young professionals who had mocked her earlier whispered among themselves, annoyed. One of them muttered under his breath. All this just because she smiles and serves tea? Alexander heard. And from where he stood, he replied without looking directly at them. Never underestimate the power of seeing another human being. That is the detail that separates leaders from failures. Silence fell once more. The storm outside was beginning to subside. Softer drops slid down the glass, as if even the sky acknowledged that something had changed. Julia returned to work, but she was no longer the same. Customers called her by name. Her colleagues looked at her with newfound respect, though some with a touch of unease. And Alexander, seated once again at his table, knew that this night would not be forgotten. Not by him. Not by Julia. But by everyone who had witnessed that, behind every plate served, there is a life worthy of being seen. As he watched Julia smile, this time, a smile without shadows, Alexander thought to himself. Does she realize how much this night has changed my own life as well? 3 months had passed since that night when Alexander revealed his identity before everyone and expelled the arrogant manager from the Whitmore Grill. The restaurant, which once seemed to carry a cold and impersonal air, now pulsed with a new energy, almost tangible. The walls remained the same, the crystal chandeliers still gleamed at the center of the dining room, but there was something different in the air, something that could not be bought with money or written into reports. The atmosphere was alive, warmed by trust, respect, and a sense of belonging. At the heart of this transformation was Julia Anderson. She was no longer the invisible waitress carrying the silent weight of endless nights. Now, she held the position of assistant manager, with a fair salary, a voice in meetings, and authority respected by her colleagues. Her uniform had changed, no longer the plain white shirt and black apron. Now she wore a discreet blazer with the Whitmore logo embroidered on the pocket. But more than her clothes, what had changed was her presence. Julia walked tall, confident, and when she spoke firmly, others listened. That night, for instance, she moved around the dining room, observing not only the service but also the customers' expressions, the details of the dishes, the posture of the waiters. She had learned from Alexander that true hospitality is not measured merely by the speed of service, but by the ability to make every person feel important. The impact of Alexander's presence was not limited to the dismissal of the former manager. Within weeks, a new training program had been implemented. Every employee, from the youngest waiter to the most seasoned chef, participated in weekly workshops focused on empathy and personalized service. One of the most talked about modules was led by Julia herself. With her practical experience, she taught how small gestures, remembering a customer's name, offering water before being asked, noticing someone's discomfort, could transform an ordinary meal into an unforgettable memory. In addition, Alexander launched a pioneering program, scholarships for employees' children. It wasn't just charity, but an investment in the future. He knew that many families carried dreams cut short by the need to survive, and he wanted to change that. Another major achievement was job stability. Precarious contracts and unstable shifts gave way to security, benefits, and recognition of long-time staff. Alexander believed loyalty only flourishes when it is cultivated, and he made sure to honor those who, like Julia, had sustained the restaurant through its hardest times. The Whitmore Grill was reborn. Customers who once came only for prestige now returned for the welcoming atmosphere. Some even commented that it felt like dining at a friend's home, only with the refinement of a high-end restaurant. The employees themselves began to smile more, not the forced smiles of the past, but genuine expressions. The weight of oppression had been replaced with a quiet pride, the pride of belonging to something meaningful. Julia often stood by the dining room doors with a lump in her throat. It felt as if she were living in another world. She still worked hard, still came home tired, but now the difference was immense. Her effort had value, it had recognition. An essential part of this transformation came from Alexander himself. He didn't just implement changes and then vanish into the obligations of his billionaire's agenda. On the contrary, he began visiting the restaurant weekly. He always arrived discreetly, without fanfare, often without a reservation. He greeted waiters, chatted with customers, and stepped into the kitchen to listen to the chefs. There were no barriers between him and his staff. They were moments that surprised everyone. Some customers, upon realizing they were dining next to the owner of the empire, were ecstatic. But Alexander wasn't seeking applause. He was there to listen, to observe, and above all, to learn. For Julia, these visits were especially meaningful. On several occasions, Alexander invited her to walk alongside him, asking about the details of daily operations. He wanted to know what worked, what still needed improvement, what stories had marked the week. And Julia always had an answer. "Sometimes it's not about big changes, sir," she said in one of those conversations. "It's about remembering that every person who comes here brings a story. If we listen to those stories, service will never be just service." Alexander smiled, satisfied. It was as if every word of hers reinforced the certainty that he had found in the right place the missing voice of the Whitmore Grill. But Julia's life wasn't transformed only inside the restaurant. Outside of it, an even greater change was taking shape. On a special Friday night, when the restaurant buzzed with customers, Julia walked into the dining room with a different light in her eyes. She wasn't alone. At her side walked a young woman with brown hair and a timid smile, Emily, her 17-year-old daughter. Julia proudly introduced her to Alexander, who sat at his usual table, observing the room. "Mr. Whitmore, this is my daughter, Emily." Alexander stood, extending his hand kindly. "Pleasure to meet you, Emily. I've heard much about you." The young woman smiled, half embarrassed. "The pleasure is mine, sir." Alexander noticed the resemblance between mother and daughter, the same spark in the eyes, the same humble yet steady bearing. And then he realized there was something more. Emily held an envelope in her hands, as if carrying a secret ready to be revealed. "Mr. Whitmore," Julia said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Emily has some news to share with you." The dining room buzzed on around them, but in that moment everything seemed to fall silent. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers trembling over the envelope. "I just received the confirmation. I've been accepted to study nursing." And she lifted her gaze, her eyes shining. "I received a full scholarship." Julia raised a hand to her face, tears instantly spilling. Alexander blinked, surprised, then broke into a wide smile. "A full scholarship?" Emily nodded. "Yes. And it's thanks to the program you created for employees' children. I was one of the recipients." For a moment Alexander was silent, a warmth swelling in his chest. He looked at Julia, already crying openly, then at the radiant young woman before him. The circle had closed. Julia gripped her daughter's hand tightly, unable to contain her tears. "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know how to thank you." But Alexander didn't answer right away. He simply looked at the two of them, absorbing the weight of that moment. It wasn't just a scholarship, it wasn't just a benefit. It was an entire family's future transforming before his eyes. And that night, as the Whitmore Grill celebrated another evening full of life, a feeling lingered over all who witnessed the scene: the story was not over. Because the true transformation was not only in the restaurant, but in the lives of the people who were part of it. The dining room of the Whitmore Grill held a special glow that night. It wasn't just the reflection of chandeliers on polished tables, nor the aroma of dishes crafted with mastery. It was something invisible, yet profoundly real, a sense of purpose. The news of Emily's acceptance had spread like a breath of hope among the staff. Everyone whispered about it, some even smiling with pride, as if Julia's daughter's achievement were also their own. Julia, her eyes still wet, could hardly contain her emotion. She had lived nights of silence and humiliation, but now she stood there, watching her daughter hold in her hands a future that once seemed impossible. Later, as the restaurant calmed and some customers said their goodbyes, Alexander invited Julia and Emily to sit at his table. The simple gesture drew discreet glances. It was rare to see the owner of the restaurant empire opening space for such personal conversations. "Emily, tell me more," Alexander said, resting his elbows on the table. "What does this scholarship mean to you?" The young woman took a deep breath, her answer brimming with truth. "It means everything. I've always wanted to be a nurse. I've always wanted to care for people, just like my mother has always cared for me and for so many here. But I knew it would be impossible to afford tuition. This scholarship changed my destiny." Alexander was silent for a few seconds, absorbing every word. There was a sincerity there no amount of money could measure. Julia held her daughter's hand, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice breaking, "what you've done for us, I can never repay." But Alexander smiled faintly and replied with firmness. "No, Julia. You're the one who did this for all of us. You showed me what truly matters." all I did was open my eyes." In that moment, Alexander felt a truth that would stay with him forever. Business was not just about numbers, reports, or investments. Business was about people. People who sustained every plate served, every smile offered, every memory created within the walls of a restaurant. He, who had spent years obsessed with expansion, goals, and profits, now realized that the true legacy lay in something far deeper. It wasn't the buildings erected, nor the awards won. It was the ability to transform lives. And Julia had been the key to that rediscovery. Over time, Julia became an inspiration for new employees. Young waiters who arrived insecure found in her not just a leader, but a mentor. She repeated to them what she herself had lived. It doesn't matter if someone pays for the most expensive meal or the simplest one. Every person deserves to be seen. The Whitmore Grill, once marked by coldness, now breathed like a true family. Employees celebrated birthdays together, supported each other through hard times, and rejoiced in small daily victories. Julia was the beating heart of this change. And Alexander, even from afar, knew he had made the right choice by trusting her. Soon, the effects of the transformation spread beyond the restaurant's walls. Customers spoke of the welcoming atmosphere, of how they felt unique when being served. Industry magazines began citing the Whitmore Grill not only for the refinement of its menu but for the example of human-centered hospitality it radiated. Other establishments in the chain started adopting the model: empathy training, scholarship programs, recognition of long-standing employees. What had begun as a single gesture spread like wildfire, bringing new life to the entire empire. And all of it happened because, on a rainy night, Alexander had chosen to look beyond the numbers and truly see a simple waitress. Months later, on one of his visits, Alexander paused at the doorway of the dining room, watching silently. Julia, smiling, directed the team with confidence. Emily, now in her new uniform, was working as a hospital intern, but that night she was there, celebrating the beginning of her journey. Alexander drew a deep breath and let the thought take form. Business is not just numbers. It is people. People who carry dreams, pains, hopes. People who need to be seen. Julia, without realizing it, inspired everyone around her. The Whitmore Grill had regained its soul, becoming a beacon of example for all the other restaurants in the chain. And Alexander knew this would be his greatest legacy. Sometimes the richest people are not the ones with billions in the bank, but the ones who choose to see and honor the humanity in others. If this story touched your heart, comment respect below and subscribe for more inspiring stories.